in listen-only mode.
Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on No Deal Brexit. What could it mean for musicians? My name's Freya. I'm the Knowledge Hub and Publications Manager at the ISM, and I have Robin McGhee, my colleague, here with me, who is Public Affairs and Campaigns Manager at the ISM, and he is going to talk to us about the implications of a No Deal Brexit.
I am. Hello, I'm Robin, Public Affairs and Campaigns Manager, as Freya just said. So before we begin, a few technical points. You can't see us, but you should be able to see the PowerPoint presentation, which is displayed on the screen with the title slide. You should also be able to hear me, but I can't hear you. So if you experience any technical difficulties like sound quality, please let us know in the question box and we'll make attempts to resolve the issue. The webinar is also being recorded and will be available to view on the ISM's website at ism.com, or ism.org even, /webinars. Okay, so if we go ahead, so this I think is the big problem with talking about no deal is shrug. We don't really know what no deal is going to look like because it would be a completely unprecedented territory for really any major economy, and we don't know if it's going to happen, we don't know what it would look like, and we don't know how mitigated it might be under a so-called deal-no deal scenario. So really all that follows is informed speculation. That's the best thing to say. Obviously we've been getting legal advice, we've been talking to musicians, we've been talking to colleagues in the music industry, we've been looking at the governments. We've been talking to the government, in fact, so we've got what we hope is the best advice we can, but it's ultimately speculative. So what is no deal exactly? So no deal means not having withdrawal agreement with the EU. So we crash out of the EU with no transition period. We'll lose 45 years of economic and legal infrastructure overnight if there is no deal. And the implications of that are massive, as we'll get to. So we leave the EU automatically on the 29th of March next year at 11 p.m. We'll know by the 21st of January if there will be no deal. That's actually in legislation. The government has to tell Parliament by then if there's no deal. I think it's important to put in basically everything like that has a caveat. So, for example, government could be looking at the consequences of no deal as it starts to happen and then cobble together a deal at the last minute. That's the sort of thing that could happen. It doesn't matter whether there is a deal agreed by the 29th of March. I think that's the important thing to emphasise. We leave automatically unless we and the 27 other members of the EU agree otherwise. If there is a deal, there's going to be a transition period which lasts until the end of 2020. And probably there won't be much change during the transition period. That will be when the final trading relationship with the EU is developed. And that's really significant for the music industry, actually, because that will involve a lot of negotiations around how services are treated. But if there is a transition period, it's going to be pretty much the status quo. But no deal means no transition period. Crash out on the 29th of March, and the economic implications would start kicking in pretty much as soon as no deal looks like it's going to happen. So what is the actual impact of no deal? I think it's quite important to just go over these general points before we get to music specifically, because they have lots of knock-on impacts. So the UK will be treated as a so-called third country for trade purposes with the EU. So there'll be substantial tariff and non-tariff trade barriers on many goods and services. The EU is about 45% of our trade, depending how you want to measure it. So that obviously has a monumental impact on the economy in terms of exports. We also know it's basically going to be impossible to have customs infrastructure ready in time, so there could be a shortage of basic goods due to import problems. I won't go into that now, but that's absolutely massive. In theory, planes would be unable to fly to the EU as the UK falls out of the European Aviation Safety Agency. There would be unclear status for 3 million EU citizens in the UK and 1 million UK citizens in the EU. The Prime Minister has said she'd guarantee the status of those EU citizens in the UK. But, well, we're all EU citizens now. I mean, EU 27 citizens in the UK. But we'll have to see how that goes. There would be a hard border in Ireland, so there'd be border checks, contrary to the Good Friday Agreement. There'd be severe damage to agriculture in particular, but many other sectors as well, including music, due to the end of EU funding. An immediate economic downturn and likely major recession due to these things. Probable major fall in the value of the pound, with implications, of course, for anyone travelling. And I think, to be honest with you, personally, I think that most likely the biggest thing will probably be something that we can't even predict happening now, that would come out as a result of falling out of this legal and economic infrastructure. So, pretty big deal. And let's now move on to exactly what it would mean for musicians specifically working in the EU. So, the ISM's done quite a lot of research on this. And our Musicians and Brexit report that we published in July found a third of musicians got half or more of their income from working in the EU27. So this is a big deal, and we need to make sure as an industry that we do not allow ourselves to be taken by surprise by the impact. So the key thing that would happen in terms of a musician travelling to the EU if there was no deal is that there would be the imposition of greater barriers to working in the EU. So we'd be treated as a third country. What exactly those barriers are is unclear. We have got legal advice, we've got advice from the sector about from other organisations in the sector about what this would be. The fact is, we can't give decisive, comprehensive advice about what those barriers would necessarily be. It would very possibly mean visas for individuals travelling to the EU. And it would also very possibly mean carnets for those travelling to the EU as well. It kind of depends on the attitudes of EU member states. I think it's reasonable to say that movements of goods would actually probably end up being a bigger administrative problem than movement of people. Because if we think about what I was saying just now about the transport problems, that's going to be really damaging on the ability to move equipment. And there are going to be also all sorts of problems around administration cost. Essentially, it's going to be very difficult relative to now to move things, which obviously musicians need. So we think probably the biggest impact in terms of which part of the music sector would be most damaged would probably be opera, because of the amount of stuff they have to move around. But I don't need to tell anyone that it's not just opera that moves large amounts of stuff around. Another issue that is worth raising is different rules and costs for working in different EU member states. This again is something where we just don't know what would happen. So, for example, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, has said that he would consider imposing visas for tourists, so not just work visas. Is this a bluff? Don't know. Probably a bluff, but we can't tell. But the thing is, we'd be treated as a third country, in theory, by EU member states, which means that they would have somewhat more freedom to impose restrictions on working. But again, it's very hard to see how they're going to play that, and I think politics would really come into it as well. I think another important point around no deal is there's a really short time frame. So, for example, would it even be possible for EU countries to actually have the infrastructure, literally just like the staff and the IT systems in place to accommodate significant changes in the rules? This could definitely benefit us if they just decided, okay, we'll just sort of maintain the status quo, but that's not guaranteed. Barriers to the actual travel itself are also really something quite important, and this is why I wanted to emphasize the sort of wider problems for the whole country of no deal first, is that, if, as theoretically would happen, there wouldn't be planes flying between the UK and the EU, that obviously is going to have an enormous impact. I would also say that most likely if there was no deal, there would be a essentially continuous backlog of lorries trying to get through the Channel Tunnel. and also trying to get onto ferries. And if you're carrying lots of equipment around in a lorry, that is going to affect you. And I'm afraid to say that I doubt that musical equipment would have priority in such a situation. Short term, there's also the effect of probably needing to cancel loads of events in the EU due to travel problems, due to administrative problems. That one, my understanding, is that although some parts of the industry have been affected, of course, by Brexit already, my understanding is that most parts of the industry are so far just sort of carrying on and just sort of hoping that nothing will happen, which I think is the right approach for what it's worth, but it's definitely worth bearing in mind. Another point is also that the EHIC, European Health Insurance Card, will be invalidated, so potentially larger insurance costs. So moving on to other impacts of no deal on music. So one of the significant issues is going to be that we lose access to EU funding sources such as Horizon 2020. I think that this sort of affects the whole of the creative industry. So I think individual musicians, it might not be something that's going to affect individual musicians sort of immediately, but the whole of the creative industries will be affected and it will have a knock-on effect. We possibly will be doing worse than some other industries about European funding, but agriculture will be, absolutely devastated. But it's certainly something worth bearing in mind. I think it's reasonable to say that musicians are less likely to be hired by EU venues because of all the problems that I've mentioned. Why would you go through all that hassle to get British musicians? We'd no longer be in the digital single market. That has lots of implications. One of them is that it allows musicians to collect royalties more easily. Copyright rules could change. I kind of put that in there as a sort of blanket thing. I think that would be a longer term issue. And that's also something that will be a long-term issue around Brexit generally. So I don't think that's something to sort of immediately worried about, but then I do go back to my caveat earlier that in such a completely unprecedented legal scenario, we could easily find that there might be some disaster that we can't even tell is going to happen if there was actually no deal around that sort of thing. The same really applies to contract rules. On the ISM website, my colleague Freya has put up an excellent detailed legal briefing about exactly how contract rules might change. Things like definitions in particular. That would be covered by the withdrawal agreement and the transition if there's a deal. So if there was a deal, you'd at least know what the changes were going to be. So that's the other issue. And then, yes, as I've also said, negative consequences we can't predict yet. So those are the main sort of areas I think where musicians will be affected. Again, I think mobility is the thing that I am personally worried most about, and the ISM is worried most about. We have been campaigning through our Free Move Create campaign for freedom of movement, so essentially the status quo to be preserved for musicians. And I also mentioned goods, and I think that that's a really, really important thing to bear in mind, the actual physical equipment, not just people. That applies to instruments as well. For example, in the case of instruments, one of the possibilities is there's an increased risk that somebody, if you have an instrument, could stop you asking for proof it belongs to you. That sort of administrative problem that now is not really a problem in anything like the same way, certainly. Will no deal happen? Nobody has a clue. We do not know what is going to happen, and thankfully, commentators tend to be quite open about the fact that they don't know what's going to happen. So this is where it gets really super political, so sort of bear with me. I mean, essentially, if the Prime Minister wants to have a deal, she'll need to capitulate to the EU demands. So either the UK and the Single Market and Customs Union, or a border in the Irish Sea, with Northern Ireland and the Single Market and Customs Union, because the Northern Irish border question is essentially insoluble without one of those solutions, or without the EU deciding that we'll Brexit and then sort of kick the issue down the line, which means years more negotiations of this sort. The issue, though, is can she get a deal through Parliament? Nobody knows. Loads of political unknowns there. The parliamentary maths is very, very important. Something that political nerds like me can speculate a lot about, but really nobody has a clue. And the issue is, though, going back to what I was saying, is that because no deal happens through automatic operation of the law, it's not just a question of essentially a deal does have to be struck, otherwise no deal is the default outcome. That is the whole point. So the issue is not just Theresa May striking a deal, it is then getting the deal through Parliament in time to stop no deal happening. The ISM has been working with government and parliamentarians to emphasise what the problems would be if there was no deal, and what the problems will be with the government's planned deal, which significantly restricts movement rights. And I cannot be particularly positive about the response from the political world. They simply do not really know enough about what the problems are that musicians actually face. And this is it before we even get to the wider questions around strategy around Brexit and so on. Okay, so where to find out more? Well, the ISM website, as I said, we've got a section on Brexit in our advice centre, so ism.org/advice-centre/Brexit. You can also email me, that's my email address. Anything at all that comes up, and I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can. My answer might be, I don't know, but you know, we hope that hopefully I'll be able to answer. Slightly complicated URL there for the government technical notices. Those are the government's official publications for what to do if there is no deal. I have to say I don't think they're very good. They also contradict each other in a number of ways. We fed this back to the Department for Exeter in the European Union in meetings. They also don't really address the creative industries remotely adequately, in my view. These are produced by the Department for Exeter in the European Union, so not the Culture Department, so you know, that has problems. I'd also recommend, if you're interested in looking at detailed policy analysis, the appallingly underused public resource of the House of Commons Library Notes Archive. This is something that I think should be much more widely publicised, but essentially if you're interested in detailed policy analysis, go to researchbriefings.parliament.uk and it's all there. But I mean, that is detailed policy analysis, and they don't have really that much actually affecting on the creative industries and Brexit more generally, which is annoying. So then also the question is what you can do, and please, we would be absolutely powerless if ISM members were not supporting the work that ISM staff do, of course, but also doing things themselves. Please do write to your MP and tell them about the damage no deal will cause. Honestly, most of them will not even have thought about the impact of no deal on musicians. Most of them won't have thought about the impact of Brexit on musicians. Your MP will reply to you. They will hopefully write a letter to a minister. Please do tell them, give personal examples, make it clear of the impact this would have on their actual constituency where you live. They will be interested and they will feed that back to government, and it's really important. Please do also tell us how you're being affected. That's my email address again, robin.mcghee@ism.org. And we'd love to hear how you're being affected because that really helps inform the campaigning and advocacy work that we're doing. It also means that we can encounter issues that we just hadn't thought of because there really isn't enough published about the impact of Brexit, and especially about the impact of no-deal Brexit on creative industries and musicians in particular. And above all, of course, stay informed, and you know, thank you for attending the webinar. And please do sort of keep an eye on what's happening, because I think the really worrying thing about Brexit is how people can be people cannot be informed enough, given the impact it's going to have, but also the amount of poor information out there, which we hope we've done something to alleviate.
Thank you so much, Robin, for that really insightful presentation on no deal Brexit. We have also had a couple of questions come in from people over the week, so we're going to address them. I thought it might be helpful for me to mention to any members listening that Viva La Visa, who are entertainment industry visa specialists, do offer ISM members a free initial consultation. Then after that, a discounted fee rate. So that might be quite useful in the future. It might also be useful if you're traveling to places like America and so forth at the moment. Shall we turn to some questions?
Yeah, so a question from Annika. Annika says that she is somebody who's eligible for an EU passport. So what are the options going to be for getting an A1 certificate for both UK musicians and EU musicians based in the UK? It is not really possible to give a definitive answer about what's going to happen to A1 certificates. I think it's likely that something like the status quo would continue, but this is bearing in mind the sort of possibility of something coming up that we don't really know about. But so I'm afraid I can't really give a definitive answer on that. What I can say is, if you're an EU citizen, your movement rights aren't affected, so you can go and work in the EU as now. The issue goes back to how you get your stuff there, how you get there. It goes back to the travel problems that I was talking about earlier. So Annika also says, what should we be doing to ensure we can continue working post-Brexit? We doubt people will be stopped from working. The issue is around the additional administrative financial costs associated with with restrictions on movement rights for work purposes, and, as I mentioned, with restrictions on movement of equipment. I think that the best approach in terms of how you can continue working at the moment is, as I was suggesting earlier, to sort of keep calm and carry on, essentially, and just assume that it'll all be all right, which we hope it will. In terms of other questions, so there's another question from Sue, who says she's worried about being easily replaced by a Dutch national. Well, I'm afraid the answer is yes. You could easily be replaced by a Dutch national. We are, one of the reasons why we're campaigning so much on freedom of movement is that people are, there is a danger that people will, where it's possible to substitute a EU 27 musician for a British musician, that people are going to do that. And it really is a sort of case-by-case basis question of whether people are going to do that. But if there are significant administrative, financial burdens associated with bringing British musicians over, if it's harder for them to plan a tour or even a single visit for work purposes, then that's going to affect people's decision as to who they hire. So those are the three questions that we've had. I also wanted to again, reiterate that we are campaigning via our Free Move Create campaign, which is freemovecreate.org, and we are aiming to get existing movement rights preserved for people working in the EU. But the impact of no deal is something that if it actually came along, that campaigning would get a lot more urgent. And I'm sure that it would mean trying to work with a government that was piecing together a last-minute, post-fact deal with the EU. And it's something that we're going to be spending an awful lot of time doing over the next couple of years. In fact, especially because, of course, what we're also looking at is how we can influence the final deal on services, which we expect to be coming down the line during the transition period.
Well, thank you again, Robin. As Robin said, please do email in with how everything is affecting you. It helps inform us with what we do going forward. So once again, thanks very much for listening. Please keep in touch, and we hope to see you at another webinar soon.